thanks so much for the opportunity to speak. And I'm really, really sorry I can't be there in person. I really very deeply regret that, especially after having Googled some of the pictures of Salalah and the surrounding region, which I've never had the opportunity to visit. So I hope that there'll be other opportunity in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, I want to take the next 15 minutes to talk a little bit about how the current oil boom, and I think we can talk about the boom given the recent oil price developments, differs from previous booms, and what that means, especially in terms of the maturation of public policy for the long-term diversification outlook in the region. And I want to say in particular a few things about how I believe the GCC social contract between governments and GCC citizens has changed, and how that conditions opportunities for diversification, and I think makes some types of diversification easier than it has been in the wake of previous oil booms. So I think that possibly the key difference between the current oil boom and the boom that we're witnessing currently is that fiscal policy, so government spending and revenue policies, have become much, much more mature. The spending profile, the fiscal expenditure reaction to high oil prices has become much, much more muted this time around than it was during previous booms. So all the extra dollars or reals that are now being earned are for the most part being saved. They're not being spent. And I'll show you a little graph if I manage to share my screen. Just one moment. Okay. So now you're seeing my whole glorious mess here. Sorry, that's too small. Yep, that's the right one. So I'm showing you this graph here that I just put together with the most recent IMF data, which illustrates quite clearly that in previous periods with high oil prices, so that's when the blue line, which reflects the Brent oil price on the right axis, in previous periods when the oil price went up, spending of GCC governments went up almost in sync. So the spending is the red bars. That's particularly true for the boom in the 2000s to early 2010s. It would also be true about the previous oil boom in the 70s and early 1980s. And what's very different this time is that oil prices have shot up dramatically since 2021. And so far, the fiscal reaction has been very muted. And that's really, I think, a sign of a more stable, a more mid to long-term oriented fiscal policy. It means a bit less growth in the short run because there's less fiscal stimulus, but it means much more fiscal sustainability in the long run, particularly for countries like Oman, where the fiscal situation was already considerably stretched in the run-up to the COVID period and during the COVID crisis. And it means that there's less capital expenditure on infrastructure projects. So that means relatively fewer opportunities in the construction sector in the short run. Even more significantly, so far there haven't been any of the big giveaways that we saw during previous booms. So increases in public sector salaries, large waves of public sector hiring. Instead, governments are sticking to the course of relative austerity. New generations of nationals that hit the labor market are expected to find jobs for the most part in the private sector. They're not going to be absorbed in the public sector. And that, again, in the short run means less of a kind of stimulus for consumer markets because there's less salaries injected into the economy that are spent on private goods and services. But it also means a less distorted labor market. It means stronger incentives for nationals to join the private sector as entrepreneurs or as workers. So in the long run, it's a less distorted and sort of more naturally growing economy that's less dependent on government stimulus. So I think the region should be felicitated for the maturation that fiscal policy has experienced during the last few years. And you also see that in various kind of midterm fiscal frameworks that governments have adopted that really didn't exist beforehand, when fiscal policy, government spending policy was kind of made up from year to year as governments went along. There's also been no significant reversal to revenue side reforms, to energy price increases, to the introduction of VAT. There's not a huge amount of new revenue measures in the pipeline, although in the long run there will have to be more taxation, but at least there hasn't been the kind of reversal that we saw during previous booms. So no short-term giveaways and sort of a more stable fiscal policy that generates less growth in the short run, but more stability and a less distorted economy in the long run. So that's sort of the real significant positive change that I see. But there are also a number of structural continuities in how GCC economies function in ways that really are not that different from previous booms. Now, I'll show you a little bit of data on that, and those factors still continue to constrain the diversification path all across the GCC, including Oman. Sorry, my screen's frozen. So one fundamental structural fact is that GCC economies still depend to a very important extent on government spending. So if you look at the ratio of government spending to GDP, to the whole economy, this continues to be quite high, both compared to previous periods. So it went down a little bit during the 2000s oil boom, but that was just because the oil sector was very large in nominal terms. And it really hasn't gone down significantly in the last few years. So that means a lot of private economic activity still depends on government spending, which is a natural thing in commodity-dependent economies. But it also means that it'll still take quite a while until the private sector has matured enough to kind of drive the economy by itself through privately generated demand, through private, say, salaries on the private labor market that then get recycled on the markets for private goods and services. You see sort of the same story here in a graph that shows the ratio of government consumption to total consumption. So consumption is essentially all spending that isn't investment spending. And you see with the exception of the UAE, the GCC economies continue to be above sort of relevant international benchmarks like Turkey, the UK, and Singapore that I put in here. And even so, there's more government consumption relative to private consumption, which again means that a lot of economic activity is government generated. And even a lot of private consumption indirectly is government financed, because in most GCC economies, the majority of the total wage bill is actually the government wage bill rather than the private sector wage bill, which is very unusual in international comparison. So in international comparison, in advanced economies, something like 20 to 30% of the total wage bill is the government wage bill. In Saudi Arabia, for example, the government wage bill is something like 60% of all wages paid in the economy. So that means that consumers, households that spend money privately are actually financed to a very large extent through government spending. So again, that's sort of a token of dependence on government spending that's quite deep-seated and that'll take a while to overcome. Although there are gradual steps of especially nationalization in local labor markets. So a larger share of nationals taking private jobs, especially because government jobs aren't as easily available anymore, and then receiving relatively higher salaries and spending more of those salaries in the local private economy, which means that there's more autonomous private demand generation. It is also true, though, that salaries in governments do tend to be higher for all countries where we have data, including just looking at citizens. And it means that nationals, when they can, still tend to prefer government jobs. So there's still an orientation towards the government that's only very gradually shifting. But as I mentioned, pretty much all GCC governments, including in very rich countries like Qatar and the UAE, have sort of moved away from the automatic job guarantee for nationals in government, with the one exception of Kuwait, where the political pressure is just so high that still everyone gets hired by government. So that means that in the long run, there's going to be more private employment of citizens in the private sector because they don't have the easy government job alternative anymore. And there's going to be more demand generation in the private sector because nationals spend more money locally and they tend to also have higher wages. So it's a difficult adjustment for the private sector because national labor is more expensive. It requires more training. It's less easily controlled than expatriate labor. But in the long run, it'll lead to a more normal economy that's more autonomous from government spending. And of course, if you're born, say, after the mid-90s or after the year 2000, then as a GCC citizen, you've kind of have bad luck because you're less likely to get a government job. The old social contract doesn't work for you so easily anymore. So we have a stratification of societies of sort of insiders who still got a government job, and then those who were born too late and who have to make do in the private sector. But I have to say that so far this transition, which I thought would be socially and politically quite problematic, has been relatively smooth. So a lot of GCC citizens, the young job seekers who don't get government jobs, have kind of adjusted and put up with that situation in a way that was much less disruptive than I thought. I mean, occasional demonstrations and unrest and unemployment issues notwithstanding. For the time being, though, the majority of nationals do work in government. The largest share of wages is paid in government, and the private sector still predominantly employs foreigners, as we see in the graph on the left. So by far the largest employment in all GCC economies is for foreigners in the private sector. And that's one structural factor that has been holding back diversification because of the particular type of employment, which tends to be low skilled and low cost, which is a natural outcome of sort of the open migration regime that the GCC has kept in place for decades. Because it's in the low skilled segment where wage cost differentials across countries are by far the largest. So you can make by far the largest savings as an employer by going for low skilled labor, because low skilled labor from, say, South Asia is very, very cheap, whereas high skilled labor is expensive no matter where you import it from. So that's sort of a natural tendency to arbitrage, go for the lowest skilled and lowest cost labor, which reduces costs for producers for the private sector in the short run, but in the long run undermines diversification because it'll be very hard to upgrade technology, to innovate on the basis of relatively low quality labor. So one big question is, apart from the move towards a more nationalized private labor force, what are GCC economies going to do about their migration regime and incentivizing more high-skilled foreigners to come in rather than low-skilled foreigners? And I think there have been some encouraging signs, particularly in the UAE, recently to some extent in Saudi Arabia, but the broad model still is that companies import a lot of cheap labor that guarantees good margins in the short run, but makes real diversification and technological progress a lot harder in the long run. It's a big policy question what to do about this, whether to make low-skilled labor relatively more expensive, put quantitative limits on it. And in any case, the transition to a higher skilled labor force is going to be a bit bumpy. So it's a long-run process, and it's going to eat into some of the margin, particularly in more labor-intensive sectors across
can we
the
try
private
to wrap
sector.
up, ستيفن, please?
Yeah. Here's the last slide, which unfortunately is not the most optimistic slide. We see here the productivity levels of GCC economies over time, again compared with some benchmark cases, and this is really the outcome of the dependence on low-skilled foreign labor. Productivity, so the output per worker, the GDP generated per worker, has been quite stagnant over time. So for kind of deep-seated diversification to new sectors, new products to take place, something probably has to happen about the migration regime, and has to be a shift towards both employing more national labor, which is already happening, but also shifting towards higher quality foreign labor. But just to wrap up the whole story in a sentence or two, I think the current boom has been handled much more maturely than previous booms. I think that there's been much less sort of regression on patronage spending and subsidies and all those things that could benefit the economy in the short run, but undermine diversification in the long run. And that there is a transition happening towards a more private-driven economy that relies more on national entrepreneurship and labor, but it's a slow process, and there's still a lot of policy decisions to be taken to facilitate that kind of process. But stop right here.